In 2018, a British company set fire to 28 million pounds of its own product. Not damaged goods, not expired stock, trench coats, handbags, perfume, all of it new, all of it sellable, all of it burned on purpose in a controlled facility by a company that was profitable that same year. The company was Burberry. When the numbers surfaced, buried on a page of an annual report nobody expected anyone outside the finance department to actually read, the public reaction was fury. Shareholders asked why the stock hadn't been offered to them first. Journalists called it fashion's dirty secret. Everyone treated it like a moment of corporate insanity.
It wasn't insanity. It was a decision made by people who understood their business better than the people criticizing them did. And it wasn't even close to unique. Cartier's parent company, Richemont, was reported to have destroyed several $100 million worth of watches over a longer stretch of time. A Swedish fast fashion retailer with a very different price point, H&M, was found to have incinerated roughly 60 tons of clothing since 2013. Two companies at opposite ends of the price spectrum doing a version of the same strange thing, for reasons that only make sense once you understand what each of them is actually selling. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly why burning that money was rational. You'll also understand something bigger, that the number printed on a price tag tells you almost nothing about the underlying health of the company that produced it. Here's the assumption almost everyone carries around without ever examining it. A $3,000 coat means a healthy, high-margin business. A $15 t-shirt means a company grinding out pennies hoping volume saves it. Expensive equals safe. Cheap equals fragile. That assumption collapses the moment you ask a more basic question. What is each of these companies actually selling? Start with luxury, because it's the more counterintuitive of the two. A luxury fashion house is not, structurally, in the business of selling clothing. It is in the business of selling scarcity. The garment is the delivery mechanism. The actual product is the feeling of owning something that most people can't. This sounds like marketing language until you look at the math. Luxury markups routinely run somewhere between 3 and 10 times the cost of production, sometimes higher, with no meaningful ceiling. Retail gross margins in luxury fashion can land in the 75 to 85% range, well above the 55 to 70% that's typical across the broader apparel industry, and well above the 50 to 60% wholesale margin a mid-tier brand usually targets. On paper, that looks like the best business in the world. Sell something for 10 times what it costs to make, and you'd assume you're printing money. But here's where the logic gets strange. In nearly every other category of retail, the way you sell more units is by lowering the price. Cheaper products move faster. That's basic. Luxury runs on the opposite law. Economists describe it through what's known as the Veblen Effect, a good where demand can rise as the price rises, because the price itself is the thing being purchased, not just a barrier to purchasing. Cut the price of a luxury handbag in half, and you haven't made a better deal. You've made a worse product. You've told the market that anyone can have one, which means almost nobody who mattered still wants one. That single inversion explains almost everything strange about how luxury operates, including its most extreme pricing gaps. A men's accessory manufactured by a supplier in Italy was reported to have cost around €53 to assemble, while retailing above €2,500 through Dior, a gap wide enough to trigger an actual government investigation. That specific case is an outlier, not an industry norm, and it's currently disputed by the brand involved. But the direction it points toward isn't an outlier at all. In luxury, the distance between cost and price isn't primarily a measurement of materials or craftsmanship. It's a measurement of scarcity manufactured on purpose. Now flip to the other end of the industry, because fast fashion is built on the opposite bet entirely. A company like Zara isn't selling scarcity in the luxury sense, it's selling speed. Its entire existence is organized around one number: how fast a design can move from a sketch on a designer's desk to a hanger on a store shelf before the trend it's based on dies.
The industry standard for that cycle, historically, has run somewhere between 4 and 8 weeks for most competitors, and as long as 6 months to a year for traditional seasonal fashion houses working a full season in advance. Zara's parent company, Inditex, compressed that same cycle down to roughly 15 days through a system the company itself calls rapid-fire fulfillment. Some case studies put door-to-door timing as low as 2 weeks.
That's not primarily a fashion achievement. It's a logistics achievement wearing a fashion company's clothes. Inditex's main distribution hub, centered in northwestern Spain, can process up to 2.5 million items in a single week. Stores receive fresh stock twice a week, every week, without exception. International locations get restocked by air freight, landing new merchandise on shelves within 48 to 72 hours of a decision made at headquarters, rather than waiting weeks for ocean freight. Here's the part almost nobody notices, though. Zara doesn't flood its stores with huge quantities of any single item. It deliberately manufactures in small batches. That's not a cost-saving measure, it's a scarcity strategy, a cheaper, faster-moving cousin of what luxury does with prestige. If a shopper sees something they like, they know it might not be there next week, so they buy it now instead of waiting for a discount. Fast fashion didn't invent scarcity. It built a version of it that resets every 14 days instead of depending on a century of brand mythology to sustain it. So now there are two completely different machines standing side by side. One sells the feeling of exclusivity and prices accordingly. The other sells the fear of missing a trend window and prices accordingly. Which means the markup numbers everyone assumes equal profit don't actually mean what most people think they mean.
A mid-tier apparel brand typically marks its production cost up somewhere between 2.5 and 3 times to arrive at a wholesale price, then applies roughly another 2 times on top of that to reach the number a customer actually pays at checkout. A shirt that costs $30 to physically produce might wholesale around $80 and retail somewhere north of $150. That sounds like an enormous profit sitting inside every sale. It isn't, not entirely, because markup, margin, and profit are 3 different numbers, and most people only ever see the first one, the one printed loudest on the price tag. Luxury's multiple is bigger, sometimes dramatically bigger, but a much larger share of that multiple gets consumed before it ever reaches a bank account, because luxury is paying for something fast fashion almost never has to pay for, the physical, expensive theater of scarcity. Follow the luxury dollar, and it disappears into a handful of predictable places. Before anything ever reaches an incinerator, most luxury houses run a whole layered system just to control where excess product ends up. Burberry, for instance, operated a network of roughly 54 discount outlet stores against 449 full-price locations, a controlled, limited-release valve for excess stock. Even gifted merchandise handed to employees was reportedly tracked, so the company would know if a piece ever resurfaced for resale on the open market. Destruction was never the first move, it was the last one, reserved for whatever the entire rest of that controlled system couldn't absorb, which is exactly why it happened at the scale it did. Over 5 years, Burberry's total came to more than $118 million in destroyed goods. Real estate works the same protective logic, just spent earlier in the process instead of at the end of it. Flagship stores on a tiny number of prestige corridors, Fifth Avenue, Bond Street, Via Monte Napoleone, command rent that has almost nothing to do with square footage and everything to do with the address itself. Marketing spend exists to manufacture desire faster than the product could ever generate it organically on its own. Because from the inside, the logic is simple. If a $2,000 coat gets marked down to $200 and sold through an outlet or a discount chain, it doesn't just produce a smaller sale. It tells every full-price customer that the $2,000 version was never really worth $2,000 to begin with. It damages every other unit the brand will ever try to sell at that price again. Destroying the coat costs the company the value of one coat. Discounting it can cost the company the credibility of an entire price tier. Once scarcity is accepted as the actual product being sold, burning the unsold coat isn't wasteful. It's the cheaper of 2 bad options. That discipline is expensive to fund alone, which is a large part of why almost none of the world's major luxury houses are still independently owned. Nearly every marquee name in luxury now sits inside one of a small number of conglomerates: LVMH, Kering, Richmond. A parent company provides the capital, purchasing power, and global infrastructure that scarcity-based pricing requires. And, critically, it can let one struggling brand in the portfolio be quietly subsidized by others performing well. That dependency is not hypothetical. Through the first 9 months of 2025, both LVMH and Kering reported real revenue declines, driven in part by softening demand out of China. Proof that a business built on manufactured desirability is only as strong as enough people in enough major markets continuing to believe in the scarcity being sold to them. Fast fashion has its own expensive illusion to maintain. It just looks nothing like a bonfire, and it doesn't require a parent conglomerate to sustain it. Its cost isn't real estate on a handful of glamorous streets, it's infrastructure. Vertical integration, meaning the company owns its own production, its own distribution network, and every one of its own stores, rather than licensing that control away to franchisees or wholesale partners. It's the cost of running a logistics operation precise enough to move 2.5 million items a week without letting any single location run either empty or overstocked. It's paying for air freight instead of ocean freight whenever speed is worth more than the extra expense of getting it there faster. Cheap labor is not what makes this model defensible, and it never really was. Cheap labor is the easiest thing in the world for a competitor to copy. Owning an entire pipeline end-to-end, tuned to move inventory before it has time to become a liability, is not easy to copy. That's the actual moat. Fast fashion spends its markup buying speed the same way luxury spends its markup buying scarcity. Different currency, same underlying instinct. Protect the thing that makes the price tag believable in the first place. Both machines work, right up until something breaks them. And both have broken, publicly, in ways that prove exactly what's been described so far. Luxury's break came in the form of exposure. The Burberry story was never really about wasted trench coats. It was a story about what happens when a system built on controlled information gets its information made uncontrollably public. Industry insiders openly described the practice as commonplace, something everyone inside fashion already knew, that outsiders were only now discovering. But the moment it became visible to the general public, the backlash forced Burberry to publicly commit to ending the practice entirely, moving instead toward reuse, repair, donation, and recycling. Regulators moved next. France passed a law, part of a broader anti-waste framework explicitly banning the destruction of unsold goods, forcing luxury houses operating in the region to shift their entire disposal strategy almost overnight. Notice what actually broke here. It wasn't the underlying economics. Destruction was, and largely still is, a defensible decision on its own terms, given what it protects. What broke was the assumption that the practice could stay invisible forever. Luxury's fragility is reputational and regulatory. It depends on a gap between what the customer sees and what actually happens behind the flagship store. And that gap is getting harder to maintain with each passing year. Fast fashion's version of collapse looks almost nothing like a scandal. It looks like a company quietly forgetting the one discipline that justified its entire existence. Forever 21 filed for bankruptcy in 2019 and again in 2025. Both times the underlying story rhymes. During its growth years, the company began opening enormous stores, some over 100,000 square feet, department store scale, occupying space vacated by chains like Sears. Big stores need big rent, big staffing, and enough inventory on hand to keep the shelves from looking empty. When that inventory doesn't move fast enough, markdowns follow, and markdowns erode the thin margin the entire model depends on to survive. Between 2018 and 2019 alone, the company's stores across Canada, Europe, and Asia were reportedly losing around $10 million a month. Here's the causal chain that actually killed it. Chasing that physical scale consumed the capital and management attention that should have gone into supply chain investment, the exact infrastructure that made fast fashion fast in the first place. So while Forever 21 was busy filling oversized stores, competitors kept compressing their own design-to-shelf cycles. And a newer wave of even faster, even cheaper entrants, Shein, Temu, arrived and undercut the entire category on both price and speed at once. By the time of the company's second bankruptcy, its own leadership pointed directly at that foreign competition as a driving factor, and court filings reportedly showed liabilities running roughly 10 times the value of its remaining assets.
Forever 21 didn't fail because it was fast fashion. It failed because it stopped being fast fashion while still pricing and operating as though it were. It kept the model's low margins without keeping the one thing that made low margins survivable in the first place, the speed. Which points to something more dangerous than either extreme. The riskiest place in this entire industry isn't the top or the bottom, it's the middle. Think about any brand that ever tried to sell you a premium basics line at $50 or $80 a piece. Not quite designer, not quite fast fashion, positioned as the tasteful, reasonable middle ground. That middle ground carries luxury-style overhead, real flagship stores, real marketing budgets, real aspirations toward prestige pricing, without genuine scarcity control. So when sales slow, the brand discounts, and discounting without the Veblen protection true luxury enjoys erodes the brand exactly the way it would erode any ordinary retailer. At the same time, it doesn't have fast fashion's velocity either. No 15-day cycle, no vertically integrated logistics engine built to move product before it becomes dead weight sitting in a warehouse. It pays for one machine's costs while receiving neither machine's protection, which is a large part of why so many bridge brands that once looked promising quietly vanish from malls within a few years without ever making a single bankruptcy headline.
That's the part almost nobody sees coming when they enter this industry with a reasonably priced, tastefully designed brand in mind. The safest-looking price point, not too expensive, not too cheap, is very often the least defensible business of the three. Which brings this back to the fire. A luxury brand and a fast fashion brand can look on the surface like the same kind of company, selling variations of the same physical object. But one of them is fundamentally a scarcity management operation that happens to use clothing as its medium, propped up by conglomerate capital precisely because that scarcity is so expensive and fragile to maintain alone. The other is fundamentally a logistics company that happens to sell clothing as its product, protected by owning its own pipeline end-to-end rather than by owning a prestigious address. The stitching, the cotton, the factory floor, all of that is almost incidental. What's actually being built, financed, and protected is either the perception that a product is rare or the operational reality that a product moved fast enough to never need to be marked down. Both of those businesses are fragile, just not in the ways their price tags suggest. Luxury's fragility is reputational and structural. Fast fashion's fragility is operational. Neither one is safer than the other. They're just risky in completely different currencies. So the next time you're standing in front of a rack of clothing, the price tag isn't going to tell you what you think it tells you. Ask instead, is this company selling me scarcity or is it selling me speed? Because whichever answer it is, that's the real business you're looking at. And that's exactly what was burning in that Burberry warehouse in 2018.